Just to review, what is mullet theology? I know we've got some new folks joining us tonight. So it's the idea of Jesus in the front, party in the back. So the mantra of the mullet is business in the front, party in the back. So we're just applying that to theology. And it's really, we're having a little bit of fun to address the theological blind spots of the cultural South. Every culture has its blind spots, and the ours in the cultural South don't make us any better or worse than any other culture, but it does cause us to have to stop and say, okay, what are some of the blind spots that we have? And so we've tried to walk through that. We've covered the monster ballad mullet, the America mullet, the wrestling mullet, the Billy Ray mullet, the picture day mullet, the Slater mullet, and the Daga mullet so far. And by the way, after Lindsay and I wrote this book, we immediately started thinking of other mullets we could write about. So this by no means covers all the theological blind spots of the cultural South, but these are the ones that actually made the list. And so tonight we want to talk about the Joe Dirt mullet. So there's a movie called Joe Dirt. We need to be really clear, just like Talladega Nights, this is not a movie we have recommended or seen. So we've not seen Joe Dirt, but we have heard about Joe Dirt. And Joe Dirt has a fantastic mullet, a very famous mullet. But we have looked into the story of Joe Dirt, and that's why we call this particular mullet the Joe Dirt mullet. How would you describe the Joe Dirt mullet?
So the Joe Dirt mullet is the mullet that drops the kids off at church and might even come with them from time to time, but real family discipleship, however, is completely absent. The Jesus in the front of the Joe Dirt mullet is saying, I will, or I am, or I did raise my kids in church. The party in the back, though, is never taking on the responsibility to disciple the family yourself. In many cases, the Joe Dirt mullet lets the wife lead the way spiritually while the husband spends time pursuing work or his hobbies. And parents who wear the Joe Dirt mullet are often caught off guard when their children descend into all manner of immorality, brokenness, confusion, and sin. They don't see the connection between the lack of family discipleship and the shattered family.
You know, I know of parents who I grew up with their kids. Their kids were roughly my age. And I've heard them say things like, well, I raised my kids in church. I don't know what happened. And I think back to what that looked like. And their kids might be at church a couple times a month, never really plugged into anything. If they didn't really feel like coming to church, they didn't go. If they didn't feel like participating in the youth group activities, they weren't forced to do that. They weren't made to do that. And I look back at that and I think, and they'll stand up and say, would you please pray for my son or daughter? You know, I raised them in church, but they've gone off the path. And I think, you didn't raise your kids in church. You occasionally exposed your children to a cultural phenomenon of church, but you didn't raise your kids at church. And I was in their homes, and I never really saw any real family discipleship outside of church. And so I thought, even as a teenager, like, why does this family not seem to really take Jesus seriously? Like at church they do, but in their home they don't. However, I want to be careful, and we've put a note in your notes that raising your children in a godly biblical home with intentional and consistent discipleship does not guarantee they will always follow Jesus. So avoiding the Joe Dirt mullet is not about the product, godly children. So it's not about looking and saying, well, I have godly children, so I must have done this well. Or I don't have godly children, so I didn't do this well. It's not about that. It's about the process. Serious spiritual leadership and discipleship of children. Those who have invested in and discipled their children in a way that honors the Lord cannot feel guilty if those children choose a different path in life. There are no perfect parents. We all beat ourselves up over things that we wish we had done better. But I don't want you to think, well, if my kids are up and out of the church and are up and out of the house and they've walked away from Jesus, then I must have done something wrong as a parent. That's not necessarily true. Each child that becomes an adult has to make their own decision. And I know many children who are raised by godly parents and who just made the decision to walk away from the Lord. My brother was one of those for many years. And so my mom would really beat herself up over what she could have done better. And you know, I always said, Mom, you didn't do anything different for him than you did for me. And I didn't walk away from the faith. And praise God, my brother ultimately came back and is serving the Lord now. But there was a long 15-year period, and even before that, he wasn't where he needed to be with the Lord, and we all knew that. But so don't say, well, if I if my kids are ungodly or they're not living for the Lord, then clearly I did something wrong. But do look at this and evaluate, especially if you still have kids in the home. Ask the question, what can I do in order to make sure that I'm not wearing a Joe Dirt mullet? So we want to talk about some sightings. Where do you see this mullet? And we have a couple of sayings or phrases that might help you identify this mullet.
So the first one is, my church is in a deer stand, or I'm closer to God in the woods than anywhere else. And this is basically just an excuse to be able to spend more time on a hobby of hunting than actually being a part of God's family through the local church. They try to defend their absenteeism and keep a little Jesus in the front by claiming to worship the Lord better out in his creation. You might hear phrases like, I'll be at the deer camp if you need me. But the reality is the family does need him, but they don't have him because he's at the deer camp. They need him on a steady and consistent basis, but he isn't there protecting, pastoring, or leading his family. He is leaving them vulnerable for any of the countless attacks that the enemy could send their way.
And listen, I'm pretty adamant about this. I grew up hunting deer. I have no issue with deer hunting. But I know a lot of guys who say, hey, listen, the only opportunity I really have to go deer hunting is on Sunday mornings. And so, I have to miss church. And it's an unfortunate reality, but, I've got a deer hunt. And I want to teach my boys how to hunt. And, Sunday's the only day I can do it. That's not true. You could actually take a vacation day on Monday and go deer hunting. And so when I've said that, whoa, I can't miss work. Why? Well, because it's too important and you can't miss work. Okay, well, you just revealed your priorities. And so if deer hunting is that important to the development of your sons, then great. Take Friday off, hunt Friday and Saturday, and then you take your boys and get to church on Sunday morning. I won't say his name because most of you know him, but I was preaching one time and I said, hey, if you're watching us on live stream and you can't be here for health reasons, then God bless you, praying for you. But if you're watching us on live stream from the deer stand, you really ought to be in church. And so I said that. The next week somebody showed up and said, hey, Pastor, you got my number. I said, what are you talking about? He said, I was sitting in the deer stand last Sunday watching church, and you called me out. So I'm here this week. And I said, well, good. I'm glad that you're here. But you could sub that out, deer hunting, for anything else. And I've heard guys say that. I actually feel closer to God when I'm out fishing or when I'm out doing this or doing that. The only thing is that's not what God has prescribed us to do as believers. He has instructed us to gather with other believers.
Another one is, church is for women and kids. My church is right here in my recliner. As long as the wife doesn't give too much of his money to the church and his kids can still be the star athletes on the travel ball teams, the Joe Dirt mullet has no issue with his family attending the church down the street. Sorry, I feel a sneeze coming.
And
it's not
okay?
Good. Yeah, I'm good.
All right. And here's the thing. We're picking on men here a little bit. Why? Because men are spiritual leaders. And just to be frank, men are more likely to do this. It is rare that you see a man bringing his children to church without his wife. That's pretty rare. It's pretty common to see a wife who brings the kids to church and is leading the way spiritually, and dad's just absent. And so we are picking on men a little bit here, but this could be, obviously, women could say this as well. So this idea that, you know what, I'm good here, make sure those kids get to church because that's important, but I won't be there.
And then from time to time, he might come on a special occasion, but he's really just an observer. He's not participating. He's not a part of the body of local believers. And it's only if there's not a more important game or event that's happening at the same time.
Now, this next phrase, you're going to say, I don't think people really say that. Well, Lindsay and I will bear witness. People say this. We have heard this quite often over the last several years.
So again, this is to emphasize in the Joe Dirt mullet the component where family and discipling your own children is diminished. So in reaction to the news of expecting a baby, people might have said to us, "You need a new hobby. Don't you know what causes that?"
I mean, if we had $5 for every time we've heard that, we could probably take a family vacation.
Yeah.
And we've heard that quite often.
Yeah.
And we know people mean it as a joke, and people are not really, some people say it just kind of having a little bit of fun.
But here's the thing. Any kind of humor, any kind of joking, any kind of sarcasm, there's a shred of truth behind it. And what is it communicating, especially if the children hear that? And this was not a church member who said this to me once, but when we found out we were expecting Marshall, Jackson's baseball coach in Miami basically said this to me, and he was not a believer, but he actually went further to say, you're going to have to pay for all these kids to go to college. You're going to have to pay for them to be able to have cars. And how are you going to do all of this? And this is just really irresponsible. He told me it was irresponsible while Jackson was standing there in front of him. And I just told him, we don't believe that children are a burden. We see them as a blessing. And we believe that the Lord is going to provide everything we need to be able to raise our children. And I just, in my heart, I was so broken for Jackson, because what did that communicate to him? You're not valuable, and you're really a burden on your parents.
And the Joe Dirt Mullet views kids as like a lifestyle killer. Kids really cramp your style, and a large family is definitely a burden and not a blessing. That's what the Joe Dirt, and unfortunately, this can sometimes come from within the church. And so we have heard from within the church, or we have kind of felt from within the church, not First Baptist Tillmans Corner, I'm talking about the church in general. We've felt a few things. I know you felt these specifically.
Yes. The strange looks that people give you when you tell them how many kids you have, and it's more than two. It really started when we've had our third, when Sawyer was born, by our third child. But big families are weird. Kids are a burden. Wow, that really stinks for you that you've got so many kids and that you're having to spend so much time with those children. And you can see a stark difference in the amount of sincere congratulations and applause that you receive when you announce a certain accumulation of wealth or successful achievement in comparison to that of a new child. It's a huge difference. This actually comes from a friend of mine in Miami who now actually has 9 children since this quote was given. And their family is just a beautiful blend. They've adopted a few children, and she's given birth to several children. And it's just, she really recognized the difference in how people reacted to her news of we're having another baby versus if a friend or somebody said, I just got this great promotion at work, or we just bought this new house, or we just got this new car. The reaction from people is very, very different, which tells you what they believe to be valuable. And
it's not that we think all Christians should have big families, or that every couple should have big families. But I will tell you this: Christians need to have more babies. Christians need to have more babies and raise those children in a way that honors the Lord. That is a need for us. It's actually the best way to make disciples. You have more influence. If you're a true follower of Jesus, you have more influence over those people that will be in your home than you'll ever have over any other disciple. And so you have a great opportunity to make disciples there. So we need Christians to move into that, not to move away from that. And I think this thing that Lindsay and I have noticed over the years is that a kind of a traditional model with a stay-at-home mom, with a larger family who really spends a lot of time together as a family, nobody is against that, but they look at it as strange, like it's a strange thing. Where if you were to just go back 100, 150 years ago in history, it would be exactly the opposite. People would look at any other setup as really kind of a strange thing. And so we're not saying one is better than the other, but what we're saying is that we shouldn't look at families that choose to have larger families and say, well, that family is a burden. It's not. It's actually a blessing. And especially guys, we struggle with this particularly because we have a couple kids, maybe 3, 4 kids, and it's just an adjustment for us. But in order for us to kind of embrace the role that God has given us, we've got to see this and say, those children are an opportunity for me to accomplish what God intends for me to accomplish, not a burden or a barrier to what God intends me to accomplish. They're actually the path through which I will accomplish what God intends me to accomplish.
So another sighting is the phrase, I don't know why they're living like that. They were raised in church. And there comes a day in the life of every Joe Dirt Mullet when they look out from the deer stand or away from the TV and notice that their family is gone. They find that their children have become adults with zero moral compass. They are battling addictions, suicidal behaviors, endless debt, and toxic relationships. And it's because of a lack of intentional discipleship and parenting that those things come to be.
And it's not to say that if those things are present in an adult's life that it's always because of a lack of intentional discipleship.
Sure.
But one way to ensure that your kids have a higher chance of living out that kind of life is to fail to intentionally disciple them. And so the Joe Dirt Mullet can lead to a lot of those things. Well, What are the mullet dangers? I mean, many of them seem obvious, but
Yeah.
but what are they?
Well, broken families without the leadership of godly parents leads to more broken families. So it's not to say that all broken families are without hope, but it is to say that that hope doesn't come from just dropping a kid off at church. That hope comes from there being a life change in the leaders of the family, and that life change being authentic and it leading and driving every other part and aspect of the family. Broken families lead to a broken world. We see that clearly. We see more and more brokenness in our world, and that is an equal distribution to more and more brokenness in families. And I know we've talked about those statistics over the course of our study, and it's only growing, the number of families that are no longer as they were at the beginning of the marriage. So the marriages are broken, blended families, all of those things are much more common now than ever before, and it's definitely going in an increased direction. We see that the family is most easily broken when its leadership is broken. So when the leaders of the family, the mom and the dad, primarily the father as well, but the parents, when they are broken, when they are no longer pursuing Christ, when they are not being discipled themselves and discipling their children, then the family is broken.
And so you have parents, and specifically fathers, but this can also apply to moms as well, who choose selfishness over serving, laziness over leading, passivity over passion. They will find themselves in the middle of a path of destruction and actually drag their children along with them.
So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about brokenness. We're talking about choosing these things, choosing selfishness, choosing laziness, choosing passivity. That has consequences. Those things will end with a certain outcome. And so Scripture is very clear about this concept. You reap what you sow. And so sometimes it feels like you're not doing anything when you're selfish, lazy, or passive. It feels like the absence of action, but the absence of action still has results. There are still consequences for that. And so the family will be so far removed from abundant life and joy that they can't even see how to get back. And it's literally, you may say, I don't feel like I made the choice to do that. But by choosing not to be intentional and not to lead, not to serve, not to have passion for the things of God that we should be passionate about, by choosing not to do those things, you are making a choice to lead in the other way.
And you look at this list and you say, well, I mean, that's everywhere. That's not just in the cultural South. And it's true. What is different is that in the cultural South, we some folks in our culture will live this way and then tack a little Jesus onto it.
Right.
They say, oh yeah, well, I'm making sure, now don't hear me wrong, I'm raising my kids right. I'm making sure they know about the Ten Commandments. Hey, we got a Bible in our home, and I even take them down to Bible school all the time. And I drop them off at Sunday school. So it's the Jesus in the front that makes this unique to the cultural South. There are plenty of parents in the rest of the world who don't care anything about intentionally discipling their children, but they're not trying to tack some level of Jesus onto it. So it makes it particularly dangerous because there's this idea that Jesus is actually somehow a part of all this, but it's not real discipleship at all.
So the mullet makeover, how can we reshape our theology through Christ-centered principles for the Joe Dirt mullet? Well, the first one is a really big one. It's that the church is not a place. And you might have even been thinking as we were going through some of the mullet sightings and some of the mullet dangers, okay, so I just need to be really involved in church. I need to make sure we're there as much as possible and that we're plugged in and we're partnering with the church and we're doing all those things. That might have sounded like the solution. But we actually want you to realize that the church is not a place. It's not a building. And if it were a building, it would be easy to say you could replace it with a deer stand or a recliner. If you're just talking about space taken up on the earth. But that's not what we're talking about. The church is actually a body of believers. It's people working together, serving one another, worshiping together, mourning with those who mourn, and rejoicing with those who rejoice. That's what the church is. Romans chapter 12 says, "For as in one body we have many members, and the members do not all have the same function, so we, though many, are one body in Christ, and individually members of one another, having gifts that differ according to the grace given to us. Let us use them. If prophecy, in proportion to our faith. If service, in our serving. The one who teaches, in his teaching. The one who exhorts, in his exhortation. The one who contributes, in generosity. The one who leads, with zeal. The one who does acts of mercy, with cheerfulness. So this idea is that we all have areas that we can serve each other. None of us were made to be able to do everything. That was Jesus. Jesus was the one who was perfectly complete in his body. The rest of us are not. We need each other to be able to support, encourage, and equip one another to the work of God.
And so it's kind of interesting to, the church, my church is the deer stand kind of mentality. If a church is a place, then maybe that works out for you. But if you realize the church is a body, then it doesn't work out for you. So you just kind of read this list and just kind of ask, how would you do this from a deer stand? How would you prophesy if your gift is preaching and teaching? How would you preach and teach from a deer stand? How would you serve from a deer stand? How would you exhort from a deer stand? How would you be generous towards someone from a deer stand? Well, Pastor Derek, I'm going to give my deer meat away to those who need it. Put the head on the wall and give the meat away to those who need it. Well, sure, but you need to be living in community with them so that you can exercise those gifts. And you just frankly cannot do that from a deer stand inside of the body of Christ. That's not how God has designed it.
So one practical way, a very easy, quick fix that we can do in order to help us make over our theology in this is to shift our theology and even our language from going to church to being part of the church. And that really communicates that the church is the body of Christ, not the building that we have, not the name of our church, but we are a part of the church. And we're not just a part of this church. We are a part of the church that's worldwide, which means that when we are in Indonesia, we can worship with our church there. We can worship under a tree in Africa. We can worship on a cruise ship. You can worship with a group of people that get together and gather and have worship with one another.
One of the things that you can really see that this is lived out in the cultural South is go to just about any Southern Baptist church who we love, and we're thankful to be part of Southern Baptist churches. You can change a lot of things, but try changing the name or something significant about the building and see how well that goes. That will tell you real quickly where the allegiance is. And I remember working with a church one time who was, it just about to close the doors. And so we were suggesting a path forward and trying to work with the church and trying to work with some other churches and suggesting a path forward. And I remember somebody saying, oh yeah, we're on board. Now it's still going to be called this, right? Well, no, it'll probably be a new name. Well, then I'm not for it. We're keeping our name. Wow, so the name has become the idol. The church will not survive if you don't make a change. But the one change you're not willing to make is the name in order to see new life in the church. And so when you see that in a church, you realize, wow, we've forgotten that the church, we don't go to the church, we're part of the church. And so the church is not a building, it is a group of people. Next principle is to walk in integrity. So Proverbs 20, chapter 20, verse 7 says, the righteous who walks in his integrity, blessed are his children after him. So we got to realize that as parents, we have a constant audience. Our children are constantly watching us. And the decisions we make today absolutely affect and shape the tomorrow of our children. But our actions also shape their today. So it really influences who they are as disciples.
Sometimes parents think, oh, well, when my kids get a little older, I'll really buckle down and take the whole Jesus thing a little more seriously. But unfortunately, habits are formed day by day, and they become stronger and stronger. And it's not as easy to be able to just cold turkey start something new. Children need their parents to, and especially their fathers, to be present in their lives, walking in integrity. They are watching. They see much more than you realize, and it deeply affects them now and will continue to shape them even in the future. So if the church is an afterthought for us as parents, it's likely going to be an afterthought for our children. If Jesus is not Lord of our lives, then he's less likely to be Lord of their lives. If we don't take the path of life seriously, then they're more likely to follow down the path of destruction as well. And men, as spiritual leaders of your families, you have to ask the question, what are you leading them to? Because they are following you. Mm-hmm. They are following you wherever it is you're going. So what is it that you're leading your children to?
And I think that's something that as men we have to take seriously. That our children are following us. And in the case where you have a wife, mom, who's really taking the brunt of the spiritual leadership because the husband is not stepping up and doing that, mom can make a difference. There's no doubt about that. And God can bless in spite of a husband who is not leading well. but there's always going to be a drag on their spiritual development. Where if the father's leading, even if he's not really that great at it, but he's doing his best to kind of lead the way, that will pull your children like at light speed towards their development in the faith. And so, fathers, we are leading our children spiritually. There's no doubt about that. Are we leading them the way they need to go, or are we leading them in the opposite way? So the next principle is do not provoke. And just finished a sermon series, and we talked about this phrase, do not provoke. So this is, those of you who were part of that sermon series, a little bit of a rehash, and we were able to go into more detail there. But Ephesians 6:4, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. And then it's reinforced in Colossians chapter 3, verse 21. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, lest they become discouraged.
So there's a book called The Faithful Parent that is by Martha Peace and Stuart Scott that I really enjoyed reading, and I would highly recommend it to you. And in the book, they had a list of 15 types of parents that provoke children to anger. There's the proud parent, the despairing parent, the controlling and angry parent, the guess what the rules are today parent, the exaggerating parent, the must be perfect parent, the fear of what my child and others might think parent, the submissive and easily manipulated parent, the why can't you be like your brother parent, the let me live the life I've always wanted through you parent, the hands off and let the child decide parent, the tradition or culture driven parent, the omniscient or presumptuous parent, the if love is there, it is a secret parent, and the preoccupied by so many things parent. And they flesh all of these out in that book. So if you're interested in this, I would definitely recommend reading this book. But the idea here is that we are modeling for our children through these types of parenting what's really most important to us. And none of them are the gospel. None of them are our relationship with the Lord. They all would lead and provoke a child to anger.
So we got one last principle. That is to kind of rethink who you are as a parent and consider yourself a trainer or a discipler. I think the word discipler can be a little bit intimidating to us. Well, that's what the church does, but really just means teacher or trainer, someone who trains someone on how to do something. And so just imagine that you decide, hey, I'm going to get in shape. I want to get in the best shape of my life. And so you go out and you pay pretty good money for a physical trainer, personal trainer, to actually help you on your fitness journey. And so the personal trainer says, actually, I'm gonna pick you up. I mean, this must be serious. So tomorrow morning, 6 a.m., I'm gonna pick you up. So tomorrow morning, 6 a.m., you get all dressed, ready to go to the gym. Personal trainer comes. You jump in the car with your new personal trainer. Personal trainer drives you down to the gym, drops you off in the parking lot, and says, I'll be back in a couple of hours to pick you up. Well, hold on. Are you not coming in with me? No. Everything you need's in there. All the machines are in there. Go in and figure it out. Well, that's the approach that some parents take to discipleship. And I mean, if that was your personal trainer, the first thing you would say is, I want my money back. Because yeah, you're going to benefit from that. You're going to benefit from going in there and trying to figure it out yourself. But you really need somebody to kind of help show you the way and personalize an approach for you. And that's really what parenting does. So when you drop your kids off at church, we kind of have like a carte blanche approach, right? We're discipling all the kids, and we want to get to know them on an individual level. But just to be honest with you, that's really impossible to know what every single individual kid needs. But you as a parent, God's entrusted you with that. And so you get to know your kids, and you disciple your kids, and you kind of tailor what they need in any particular season of life.
And keeping the fitness metaphor going, it's not super motivating to choose a personal trainer who doesn't really work out, and they look terrible, and they eat nasty things, and they don't really know how to use the equipment, and they don't really care to learn how to use the equipment. But if you see somebody who has really turned it around, and they used to be, really disgusting, and now they look great, and they're really healthy, and they're taking really great care of themselves, then you're a lot more motivated to ask that person, what did you do? Tell me how you did it. I'm inspired by that. It's that same way spiritually. If our kids see us as infants and spiritually, and that it's not affecting our lives, it's not changing us, it's not impacting us in any way, they're going to have zero desire to learn that from us or to follow that, because it's not impacting us. So that's an important thing to remember.
And I just want to, in closing, share this verse from 3 John. 3 John's probably not a book that we read that often. It's a very short book, but there's a powerful verse in there that really challenges me as a father. John says this, I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the truth. I think that's a great statement, a great verse for us as parents even to memorize and to strive to see that our children are walking in the truth.